The rain came down sideways across the depot platform, and Emmeline Voss stood in it with her one trunk and her one coat and her one good pair of boots already soaked through to the sock. And when the station agent leaned out his window and told her the connecting coach to Miller's Fork wasn't running till Tuesday on account of the washed-out bridge, she did not cry. She had a rule about that. She said, so quiet the rain nearly ate the words whole. I've no family left to wire, no one to send for me, no one who'd come. And a voice behind her, low and rough as a gravel road, said, then you'll ride out with me, or you'll drown standing there being stubborn about it. If you've ever stood in the rain with nothing left to lose and had a stranger offer you the one thing you didn't know you were still hoping for, stay till the end of this one, because it only gets harder before it gets good. And if you're watching from somewhere the rain's coming down tonight too, tell me your town in the comments and hit subscribe. Because there's a whole family waiting on the other side of this story who need exactly what she has to give, even though not one of them knows it yet. His name was Caleb Whitfield, and he had 4 children and a ranch that was 3 hands short and a wife 11 months in the ground, and he had come to town that day for nothing more complicated than nails and coffee, and instead he'd found a woman standing on the platform who looked like she'd been left there on purpose by a world that didn't want her, which was, in its way, exactly what had happened. Emmeline was not a small woman. She had heard every unkind word there was for a woman built the way she was built, sturdy, broad through the shoulder, strong enough to sling a feed sack without asking a man to do it for her. And she had learned a long time ago that the world would try to make her small in other ways if it couldn't manage it with her body. So she had made herself useful instead. So useful that nobody had time to be unkind while she was doing it. That was her rule. The first one. Make yourself so useful, they forget to be cruel. The second rule was the one about crying. The third was never ask for more than the minimum. She did not remember exactly when she'd made these rules. She only remembered that they had kept her alive since her husband Thomas died of the influenza 3 winters back, and since the aunt who'd raised her had followed him into the ground that same terrible season, and since the last of the money from selling their little parcel of land had run out somewhere around a year ago, leaving her taking in mending and sitting with other people's sick relatives for wages that were never quite enough. Caleb Whitfield did not know any of that when he offered her his wagon seat. He only knew that something in the set of her jaw reminded him of his late wife Ruth, who had also refused, on principle, to let the world see her afraid. He did not offer out of pity. Pity was a thing he'd had enough of thrown at him this last year to know he despised the taste of it. He offered because it was the plain right thing to do, and because his own porch light 4 miles out illuminated 4 children who needed a woman's hand in that house worse than he had ever let himself say out loud to another living soul. The ride out was quiet. He did not ask her name until they were near 2 miles gone, and when she gave it, he only nodded, like he was filing it away someplace safe. She asked, eventually, because the silence had gone on long enough that she felt she owed him a reason for taking up space in his wagon, whether he needed help of some particular kind, and he said, without taking his eyes off the road, that he had 4 children and no wife, and a housekeeper who'd quit a month back on account of the youngest crying every night since her mother passed. And did Emmeline know anything about children? Emmeline said she'd raised her 3 younger cousins after her own mother died, and had buried a husband besides, and reckoned she knew grief when she met it, in a child or otherwise. Caleb was quiet a long moment after that. Then he said, stay for my kids, just till the bridge is fixed, just till you've somewhere better to be. And Emmeline, who had nowhere better to be, and hadn't for 3 years, said she would. The Whitfield place sat at the end of a long lane lined with cottonwoods gone gold at the edges, and the house itself was a good house, sturdy built, but it wore its neglect the way a face wears grief, not in any one broken thing, but in the accumulation of small ones. A porch step that needed mending, a curtain hanging crooked in an upstairs window, a yard gone to seed where a garden had plainly once stood, tended and proud, Now just weeds and the ghost of Rose. Caleb helped her down from the wagon with a hand that was careful, correct entirely without presumption, and led her up the steps. And the moment the door opened, Emmeline understood the shape of what she'd walked into. The eldest, a girl of 13 named Sarah, stood at the stove with a wooden spoon in her hand, and the exhausted, flat-eyed competence of someone twice her age, stirring a pot of something that had gone past, done, and into ruined. And she looked at Emmeline with a particular suspicion of a child who has been disappointed by hired help before, and has decided not to be disappointed again by simply expecting nothing. The middle child, a boy of 10, called Jonas, sat at the table with his arms crossed so hard his knuckles had gone white, radiating a fury that had nowhere else to go. And when his father introduced Emmeline as a woman who'd be staying to help out, Jonas said flat, "We don't need help," and left the room without being excused. The third child, a girl of 7 named Mercy, said nothing at all. She sat in the corner with a scrap of wood and a pocket knife too big for her hands, whittling something shapeless and careful. And she did not look up, not even when Emmeline crouched down to her level and said hello. The last one, not yet 2, was in a basket by the cold hearth, and she was crying, the thin, worn-out crying of a child who has cried so long she no longer expects it to bring anyone. And it was that sound, more than anything else that day, that settled something hard and certain in Emmeline's chest. She did not say anything grand. She only took off her wet coat, hung it by the door like she'd done it 100 times before, walked to the basket and picked the baby up and said, to no one and everyone, there now, I've got you." And the baby, whose name she would learn was Grace, quieted, not all at once, but enough. Enough that Sarah's shoulders came down half an inch, enough that even Jonas, listening from the hallway where he thought no one could see him, stopped his fists from clenching quite so hard. That first supper was a ruin, and Emmeline ate it anyway, and praised Sarah's effort with the pot roast in a way that was plain and unsentimental and utterly without pity. The kind of praise that lands like a fact laid gently on the counter rather than a kindness performed for effect, and Sarah, who had braced for either false cheer or quiet judgment, did not know what to do with a compliment that asked nothing of her in return. Caleb ate at the head of the table with his eyes mostly on his plate, and when he did look up, it was to watch his children, cataloging, the way Emmeline would come to understand he always did, which of them had eaten enough, which of them had said a word today, which of them had not. She stayed that first night in the small room off the kitchen that had been the housekeeper's, and she did not sleep much, listening to the house settle and creak, to Grace fuss twice and quiet again, to footsteps in the hall that she guessed correctly belonged to Caleb, checking on children who no longer needed checking on quite so often, except that his own fear told him otherwise. In the morning, she rose before anyone else and made a breakfast that did not taste of grief, and when Mercy came down and saw the plate set for her, she looked at it a long moment, and then at Emmeline and said not a word. But she ate every bite, and that Emmeline would learn was Mercy's whole language, not silence as absence, but silence as its own kind of speech, if you knew how to listen for it. The Bridget Miller's fork was not fixed by Tuesday. It was not fixed by the following Tuesday either. Emmeline told herself she was staying only until it was, and told Caleb the same, and he nodded each time, as though this were an arrangement he fully expected to end, though something in the careful way he began fixing that porch step and rehanging that crooked curtain, and turning the dead garden bed with a spade of an evening after the children were down, suggested a man who was quietly building a case for a longer stay without ever once asking for it outright. He had that habit, she noticed early on, starting a sentence and stopping just before the soft part. "I appreciate you," and then a pause. And then, "The biscuits were good. It means a lot that you'd," and then nothing. Just a nod, just his eyes going back to his plate. She noticed it. She did not call him on it. Not yet. It was Mercy who broke first in her way. 2 weeks in, Emmeline found her sitting on the back steps at dusk, with the whittled scrap of wood in her lap, and this time When Emmeline sat beside her, Mercy held it out, a small, rough shape that might have been a bird, if a bird had been carved by a child grieving her mother with more feeling than skill. "For you," Mercy said. 3 words, the first Emmeline had heard her speak since arriving. Emmeline took the little bird like it was made of glass and said only, "Thank you," and did not make a fuss, because she understood without being told that a fuss was the one thing that would send this child back into her silence for good. Mercy nodded satisfied and went back to her whittling, and something passed between them on that step that neither of them would ever need to name. The younger one, Grace, was easier in her way and harder in another. She'd stopped crying most nights now, but she'd taken to reaching for Emmeline's collar with a small fist and pressing her face there and breathing deep, like she was hunting for a smell that had gone. And once, when Emmeline asked Sarah gently what her mother had smelled of, Sarah's chin had trembled for the first time since Emmeline's arrival, and she'd said, "Lavender water. She kept a bottle on the dresser. Papa won't let anybody touch it." That was the first Emmeline understood the full shape of what this family was guarding, each in their own way against forgetting. Grace with her small hunting nose, Mercy with her careful hands, Sarah with her ferocious competence that was really just fear wearing an apron, and Jonas, whose fury she was coming to see, was grief with nowhere else to go and no permission to go there. Jonas gave her the hardest road of any of them, and she did not push it. She let him slam doors and answer her questions in single syllables, and once, memorably, tell her outright that she wasn't his mother and never would be, and she ought to just go back wherever she'd come from, and Emmeline had knelt down to his height. He hated that, she noted, being talked down to even in kindness. So she stopped doing it after that day, and said plain, "You're right. I'm not her. I wouldn't try to be, even if you begged me, but I'm here. And I intend to keep being here, and you can be as angry about that as you need to be, for as long as you need to be it. I'm not going anywhere." He'd stared at her like she'd struck him, because it was the first time since his mother died that an adult had told him his anger was allowed to simply exist without needing to be fixed or hushed or explained away. And he did not say thank you. And he did not soften all at once. That took months yet. But he stopped slamming the door to the room he shared with the tool shed on the nights. She was the one who checked on him, and that, from Jonas, was as good as an embrace. The first real trial came in the 5th week, when the autumn fever went through Miller's Fork and out along the ranches, and it took Grace first, the way it so often takes the smallest, a heat in her that would not break, and a cough that rattled wet in that tiny chest. And Caleb rode the 4 miles to town and back with the doctor, old Doc Aldous, sitting grim beside him in the wagon, and for 3 days and 3 nights Emmeline did not properly sleep, sponging the baby down with cool water, singing low things she half remembered from her own mother, holding Grace upright through the worst of the coughing fits so the child could breathe, while Sarah hovered white-faced in doorways, did not slam a single door, but instead hauled well water, without being asked, bucket after bucket, because it was the one thing his hands could do about a fear his heart couldn't hold. On the 2nd night, Caleb came and stood in the doorway of the sick room a long while, watching Emmeline work, and when she finally looked up and caught him there, he said, "You should sleep. I can sit with her." And Emmeline said, "So should you. Neither of us is going to. Sit down then and hold her a spell and let me heat more water." And he had sat and held his youngest daughter against his chest with a tenderness that undid something in Emmeline's own chest to witness, because she understood then that his silence was not coldness. It never had been. It was a dam built to hold back a flood too big for words, and she understood too why he'd never once in 5 weeks spoken his dead wife's name aloud in front of the children, though she'd heard him say it once, low, into the dark of the porch at night, when he thought no one was near enough to hear. Ruth. Just that. Just her name, offered up to the dark like a small coin dropped into a well. Grace's fever broke on the 4th morning, in the gray hour before dawn, and Emmeline felt the small body cool and slacken into true sleep rather than the fitful half-sleep of sickness, and she wept then, finally, quietly, alone at the kitchen table with her face in her hands, because her rule about not crying in front of others held even now. Vitamin exhausted past reason, even relieved past speech. And it was Caleb who found her there, and who did not say a word, only pulled out the chair beside her and sat, close enough that his shoulder nearly touched hers, and let her have the moment entire before he said low, "Thank you." Not for the biscuits this time. Not half a sentence cut short, the whole of it, plain, offered, complete. She looked at him and said, "You don't have to thank me for loving a child who needed loving." And something passed over his face then, that she would spend a long while trying to name, and would eventually understand was the particular terror of a man who has just realized he is beginning, against every wall he'd built, to feel something he is not at all sure he has permission to feel. The town, of course, had opinions. It always did. Miller's Fork was not a large place, and a widow rancher taking in an unmarried woman to keep his house and mind his children was, to certain quarters of that town, an irresistible subject, and the woman who made herself the loudest voice on the matter was Mrs. Adelia Pruitt, wife of the bank's junior partner, a woman whose particular gift was dressing cruelty up as concerned so thoroughly that half the town mistook it for genuine Christian charity. It was Mrs. Pulley Pruitt who first remarked, at the sewing circle, in a voice pitched to Carrie, that she did wonder what kind of woman would agree to live unchaperoned in a widower's house. And it was Mrs. Braun Pruitt who brought a basket of clothes for the children to the Whitfield door under the guise of charity, and used the visit to walk every room of the house with her eyes cataloging, the better to report back what she'd seen. And it was Mrs. Pruitt who within the month had ensured that the whole of Miller's Fork had a version of the story in which Emmeline Voss was either a scheming opportunist angling for a rancher's land, or a woman of low virtue who'd worked her way into a grieving man's home by exploiting his children's need, and neither version had a shred of kindness in it, nor a shred of truth, but both were the kind of story that a certain sort of town likes to tell itself about a woman who does not apologize for existing. Emmeline heard the first whisper of it from the grocer's wife, delivered with false sympathy over a sack of flour, and she said nothing, because she had a rule about that too. She would not spend herself defending her own name to people who'd already decided not to believe her. But she noticed that week how the greetings in town grew colder. How a few doors that had been opened to her began quietly to close. She did not tell Caleb. She thought she was protecting him from a thing he had enough weight to carry already. She was wrong about that, though not for the reason she feared. She was wrong because Caleb Whitfield, for all his silences, missed very little that happened to the people under his roof, and he had heard the talk himself from men at the feed store who thought they were doing him a kindness by warning him, and he had said nothing to them either, only paid for his nails and left, because his own rule, unspoken but absolute, was that he would not dignify cruelty by answering it on cruelty's terms. The second trial arrived hard on the heels of the first, wearing a banker suit. Whitfield Land carried a note, taken out 2 winters back, when Ruth's long illness before her death had drained the family of every spare dollar, and the note was held by the very bank where Mrs. Pruitt's husband served as junior partner, and it was no accident at all, though it would be dressed up as one, that the bank's senior partner, a hard, careful man named Elias Corbin, called Caleb in that autumn to inform him that the note's terms were being reviewed, and that given certain concerns about the stability of the household, concerns that had, Caleb understood at once, been fed to Corbin's ear by a woman who considered herself merely a concerned neighbor. The bank might need to call the note early unless Caleb could produce a lump sum against it within 60 days, a sum that both men in that office knew full well the ranch could not produce. Not with the herd thinned by 2 hard winters and the fever season just past, having eaten into what little reserve remained. Caleb came home from that meeting gray in the face, and it was the first time Emmeline saw him fully unguarded, sitting at the kitchen table with his head in his hands, and when she asked, plain, what had happened, He told her the whole of it because somewhere in the last 2 months he had stopped being a man who kept things from the woman under his roof, though he still had not found the words for the larger thing growing quietly beside the fear. 60 days, he said, and no way to raise it that I can see short of selling off stock I need for spring, which only puts me further behind next year, or selling parcels of land I can't spare without gutting what makes the place worth anything at all. Emmeline sat across from him and did not offer empty comfort. She said instead, "Then we'll find the 60 days worth of work between us, and we'll go to the bank ourselves and show him the books. And if Elias Corbin still calls the note after seeing a ranch run honest and hard, then that's a decision he's making about more than money, and we'll answer that when it comes." She did not say if. She said we. He noticed that word the way a starving man notices bread. They worked that autumn like the two of them were trying to outrun winter itself. Emmeline took in mending and doctoring work from 3 farms over to bring in what coin she could, refusing every penny of it for herself and setting it instead in a tin on the mantel marked, in her plain hand, for the note. Caleb worked the herd from dark to dark, and Sarah, once she understood what was at stake, threw herself into the household accounts with a fierce, frightened competence that Emmeline gently redirected, insisting the girl was 13 and needed an hour a day that belonged only to her, needlework, or reading, or simply sitting on the porch doing nothing at all, because Emmeline had seen what happened to girls who were never allowed to simply be young, and she would not let it happen twice under one roof. Jonas, given an actual outlet for the fury that had nowhere else to go, took to mending fence with a single-minded ferocity that impressed even his father, and one evening, exhausted and sweat-soaked and proud, in a way he hadn't let himself be in a year, he told Emmeline unprompted that his mother used to help mend that same fence line every spring, and that he could still hear sometimes the particular sound her laugh made when a fence post gave way under her hand, and Emmeline said only, "Then I'm glad you've got that sound to keep," and did not press further. And Jonas, for the first time, did not stiffen at the mention of his mother in front of her. It was Mercy in the end who gave them their strongest weapon, though none of them saw it coming. The child had taken, over these weeks, to carving small animals from scrap wood, with a skill that had grown fast and sure under the patient attention Emmeline gave to every finished piece, praising the craft plainly, without gushing, the way you'd praise good honest work from anyone of any age, and Doc Aldous, visiting to check on Grace's lungs one last time after the fever, had seen a shelf of Mercy's little carved creatures, a fox, a rabbit, a bird with an oddly crooked wing that was, everyone in the house understood without saying so, meant to be the bird Mercy had first given Emmeline for his granddaughter's birthday, and Mercy, who had not spoken more than a handful of words to anyone outside the family in 2 years, looked at him and said, clear as a bell, 50 cents. The whole kitchen went still. Caleb's spoon stopped halfway to his mouth. And then Doc Aldous laughed, a big, delighted laugh, and paid the 50 cents on the spot, and told everyone he knew in town about the silent Whitfield girl who'd found her voice over the price of a wooden fox, and inside of 2 weeks, Mercy had more orders than she could carve, and inside of a month, the money from her small animals, added honest penny by honest penny to the tin on the mantel, was a real and meaningful sum, not enough on its own, but enough to mean something, enough that when Mercy set her latest coin in the tin herself, she looked up at her father and said, 5 words, the most she'd strung together yet, "This one's for staying, Papa." And Caleb Whitfield, stoic, calcified, silent, Caleb Whitfield, had to leave the room for a few minutes after that, and when he came back his eyes were red-rimmed, and he did not pretend otherwise. And nobody in that kitchen thought less of him for it. The 60 days ground down toward their end, with the tin on the mantel holding a sum that was earnest and hard-won but still short enough that Emmeline lay awake some nights doing the arithmetic over and over, as though a different sum might appear, if she only added it up enough times. And it was on one of those sleepless nights that she finally told Caleb the thing she'd been carrying since the day the whispers started in town. She found him on the porch where he so often was, after the children were down, sitting in the dark with his hands loose between his knees, and she told him about Mrs. Pruitt's visits and the cold shoulders in town, and the story that had grown up around her like a weed nobody had troubled to pull. And she told him, too, the part she'd been most ashamed of admitting, which was that some nights she wondered if her staying was doing this family more harm than good, giving the town a stone to throw and the bank a reason to squeeze, and that if it would ease things for him and the children, she would go quiet and not make a fuss of the leaving. Caleb was silent long enough that she thought she'd misjudged even asking, and then he said low and rough, "I keep starting sentences. I don't finish, you've noticed. I know you have." She said she had. He said, "I do it because the end of the sentence scares me more than the note at the bank does, more than the fever did, more than near about anything I can name. But I'm going to finish this one, because you deserve better than half of anything from me, especially the truth." And then he told her plain that the last 2 months had been the first 2 months since Ruth died, that his children had laughed at supper, that Mercy had found her voice, that Jonas had let his anger have somewhere honest to go instead of curdling in him like poison, that Grace reached for someone's collar now instead of crying into an empty basket. That, Sarah had remembered, even for an hour a day, how to be 13 instead of 40, and that none of it, had happened because of the money in the tin or the fence Jonas mended or the fox Mercy carved. It had happened because of her. "I'm not asking you to stay to save my ranch," he said. "The ranch can go to the bank before I'll let you believe that's the whole of why I want you here. I'm asking you to stay, because this house was a house of people surviving each other's grief before you came, and now it's a house of people living again, and I don't." And here he stopped, the old stopping place, the half-finished sentence, and Emmeline waited, and this time he pushed through it. "I don't want to go back to only surviving. Not the children, and not me either. Stay. Not for the 60 days. Stay after." She did not answer right away, because her own rule, the one about never asking for more than the minimum, about making herself useful enough that no one need be asked to want her for her own sake, was cracking open in her chest like river ice in a thaw, and it took her a moment to find her feet on the other side of it. When she did, she said only, "I've no family left, Caleb. I told you that the first night, on the platform, I didn't say it to be pitied. I said it because it was true, and because I didn't think it would ever stop being true." And Caleb Whitfield reached across the small space of porch dark between them and took her hand. Careful, correct, entirely without presumption, the same as he had helped her down from the wagon that first day, and said, "It's not true anymore. Whatever else happens with that note, whatever the town decides to say about it, that part stopped being true the day you picked my daughter up out of that basket and told her you had her. You have a family. Emmeline, it's just been waiting on you to believe it." The 60th day came gray and cold, with the first hard frost silvering the fence line. Jonas had mended fence post by fence post, and the Whitfield wagon rolled into Miller's Fork carrying Caleb and Emmeline and the tin from the mantel, and the ranch's account books kept honest and current in Sarah's careful hand. And they walked into Elias Corbin's bank office together, and laid the sum on his desk, short of the full note by some $40, and laid the books open beside it. And Emmeline, who had decided somewhere on the ride, in that her rule about never asking for more than the minimum had done all the surviving it was going to do for her, spoke first, before Caleb could, and said plain to Corbin's face, "You've been fed a story about this household by a woman who's never once set foot past our parlor. And you've let that story do your thinking for you instead of these books, which show a ranch worked hard and honest through 2 bad winters and a fever season. And a note that's been paid on time every month it stood, save for the one you're threatening to break early over gossip, dressed up as prudence. We're $40 short today. We won't be $40 short in 30 more. The question isn't whether this family can pay. The question is whether you're the kind of banker who calls a note on rumor, or the kind who reads a ledger." The room was very quiet. Corbin looked at the books a long while, and looked at the tin of hard-earned coin, penny and fox carving and mending money all mixed together, and looked finally at Caleb, and asked him straight whether the household concerns he'd heard tell of held any water at all. And Caleb said, "The only concern in my household, Corbin, was whether my children would ever laugh again after their mother died. That concern's been answered. By her." And he nodded at Emmeline. In front of God and the banker and the whole of Miller's Fork, if word got out, which it would, and did. Corbin extended the note 30 days on the strength of the books alone, which was, everyone understood, as close to an apology as a careful man like that would ever offer. And word of the meeting was around town by supper, carried first by Corbin's own clerk, who had listened at the door and thought Emmeline's speech too fine not to repeat, and it reached Mrs. Pruitt's ear by way of 3 different mouths before nightfall, each version slightly more flattering to Emmeline than the last. And Mrs. Pruitt, who had built her whole campaign on the assumption that a woman like Emmeline Voss could be talked over and around but never talked to directly, found herself for the first time in the whole affair without a story left to tell that anyone in town still wanted to hear. It was Mrs. Pruitt's own housekeeper, in the end a quiet woman named Odile, who had worked in that house for 11 years and had said not one word in all that time about the things she'd heard behind closed doors, who delivered the final blow. And she delivered it not out of malice but out of a long, worn, thin patience finally giving way. At the church social the following Sunday, with half the town in earshot, Mrs. Pruitt made one more pass at the subject, remarking loudly to a cluster of women near the punch bowl that she did hope the Whitfield situation would resolve itself properly before it did the children more harm. And Odile, standing nearby with a tray of cups, set the tray down with a click and said, in a voice that carried twice as far as she likely intended, that she'd cleaned Mrs. Pruitt's parlor 11 years and heard 11 years of concern for other people's households. And in that whole time, she'd never once heard Mrs. Pruitt express half so much concern for the 4 children living without a mother, 4 miles out as she had for making sure the whole town knew who was keeping house for them, and that seemed to her, Odile said, less like Christian charity and more like a woman who couldn't abide watching somebody else's grief turn out better than her own gossip had planned for it. The punch bowl cluster went dead silent. Mrs. Pruitt went the color of a boiled beet, and Odile picked her tray back up and walked away, having said, in under a minute, everything the whole town had needed someone braver than themselves to say for 2 months running. After that, the tide in Miller's Fork turned the way tides do, quietly, and all at once, and as though it had always been running that direction. Doors that had gone cold reopened. Women who'd whispered began instead to send over pies with genuine notes attached. And Doc Aldous, who had never once believed a word of Mrs. Pruitt's story, and had said so to anyone who'd listened from the start, took to telling, at every opportunity, the tale of the silent Whitfield girl who'd found her voice over the price of a wooden fox, until it became one of those stories a town tells about itself for years afterward, softened and burnished with each retelling. The kind old-timers repeat on porches to children not yet born when it happened, as proof that a place can be unkind and still, eventually, come round to its better nature. Winter came on in earnest after that, the real winter, deep and white and long, and the Whitfield house wore it differently than it had worn the winter before. There was a fire kept high in the hearth every evening, and there was noise in that house now, good noise. Sarah's laugh, freed at last from the weight of running a household too young, ringing out over some small joke of Jonas's, because Jonas had become, to everyone's surprise including his own, the deadpan one-liner deliverer at the supper table. Dry as his father used to be before grief calcified him, proof that the family's old humor had only been buried, not gone. Mercy carved by the fire most evenings, her order book kept, at her insistence in her own careful hand, filling with names from 3 counties over now, and she spoke more each week, not in floods, never in floods, but in small, sure sentences offered when she had something worth saying, which Emmeline had come to understand, and none the worse for it. Grace had stopped hunting for lavender and collars quite so often, though she still did it sometimes, At dusk, and Emmeline had taken on those evenings to touching a little lavender water, bought quiet from the mercantile, with Caleb's blessing. Once he'd finally been able to say Ruth's name at the supper table without the whole room going still around it, to the color of her own dress, not to replace what was lost, but so the child would always have some thread of that scent to hold on to. A bridge built on purpose between a mother remembered and a house still, gently, moving forward. Caleb finished his sentences now. Mostly. Not always. Some old habits wear slow. But Emmeline had stopped needing him to finish every one, because she had learned to hear the whole of what he meant, even in the half he managed to say, the way you learn to hear a whole song from a few opening notes once you've heard it enough times through. He asked her, that winter, on an evening quiet enough that even the children seemed to sense the shape of the question coming and made themselves scarce without being told whether she would consider making the arrangement a permanent one, in every sense the law and the church could offer. Not because the ranch needed a wife or the children needed a mother in name, as well as fact, though both those things were true, but because he did not know how to imagine his own life anymore without her in the middle of it, and he did not particularly want to try. Emmeline, who 3 months back would have answered that question, if it had ever come, with careful practicality, weighing what was sensible against what was safe, found instead that she answered it the way Mercy had learned to answer things, plain, sure, offered whole. She said yes, and then she said, because it seemed important that he hear the whole truth of it, and not just the answer, I told you once, I'd no family left. I want you to know I don't say those words anymore, not even to myself, not even in the dark. I stopped believing them somewhere around the night Grace's fever broke, if you want the truth of exactly when. I just hadn't found the courage yet to say so out loud. They were married in the spring, in the dooryard under the cottonwoods that had gone from gold to bare to green. Again across the turning of that hard transforming year, with the whole of Miller's Fork in attendance, including, at the very back, arriving late and leaving early but arriving nonetheless, Mrs. Pratt, Adelia Pruitt, who had never once apologized outright for the winter of whispers she'd spent trying to unmake this family before it had properly begun, but who brought, as her gift, a length of good lace, and who said, stiffly, to Emmeline at the edge of the gathering, that she supposed she'd been wrong, and that she hoped the household would prosper, which was, from a woman like that, very nearly a confession. And Emmeline took it, and the lace, in the same open hand, because she had long since stopped needing anyone's apology to know the truth of her own worth. Sarah stood up at that wedding, not as a mother to her siblings, but as a girl of 14 in a new dress, laughing freely at something Jonas whispered in her ear, the two of them thick as thieves, now in a way that had nothing left of survival in it and everything of ordinary sibling mischief. Jonas himself gave a small carved box to Emmeline as his own gift, plain and a little rough at the joint, made with his own 2 hands under Mercy's patient instruction, and inside it, when Emmeline opened it that night, was a fence nail, just one ordinary, and bent slightly from use, and a note in Jonas's careful, dafferful hand that said only, "From the fence Mama used to mend. Now it's yours to keep too." Mercy gave her the crooked-winged bird's twin, carved fresh. The pair of them meant to sit together on the mantel where the tin for the note had once stood, the debt long since paid in full that same spring, ahead of schedule on the strength of a herd that had come back strong, and a season's worth of small wooden foxes and rabbits sold 3 counties wide. And Grace, not yet 3, too small to understand any of the ceremony beyond the fact that everyone she loved best was gathered in one place and smiling, simply reached up to be held, and was held by a woman who had once stood on a rain-soaked platform with nothing left in the world to claim as hers, and who stood now under blossoming cottonwoods with her arms full of somebody else's grief transformed at last into something that looked, from any angle you cared to view it, exactly like home. The old-timers in Miller's Fork tell it still. Some winters, when the talk turns to hard seasons and how a person comes through them, how a rancher's whole household nearly came apart in the year after his wife died, and how it was put back together, piece by careful piece, not by money, though money mattered, and not by time alone, though time did its slow work too, but by a woman who arrived with nothing but a wet coat and an empty trunk and a rule she'd made to survive being told, over and over, that she was too much of some things and not enough of others, and who found, in a house full of other people's grief, the exact shape of the place the world had never quite made room for her before. They say the crooked-winged bird still sits on that mantle, years on, alongside its twin, and that the fence Jonas Whitfield mended that hard autumn still holds true along every post, and that if you ask any one of those children now grown what home means to them, not one of them reaches first for the house or the land, or even for blood they reach. Every one of them, for the memory of a woman who stood in a rainstorm and said she had no family left, and a man who answered her, plain and certain, in the only way that ever really answers that particular grief. Stay. Not because we need you, though we do. Stay because this is where you belong, and it was always going to be, from the very first mile of that muddy road, whether either one of you had the courage yet to call it so.